Hello again, everybody. This is Dr. Jacob Gran. So far in the video series, we've only studied voice leading with consonant triads. Today we're going to introduce a larger category of dissonant voice leading chords. Here's the chord progression from the beginning of Bob Dylan's 1983 song, Joker Man. This also happens to be the same chord progression used by Andrew Gold in Thank You for Being a Friend, better known as the Golden Girls theme song.
Thank you for being a friend. Travel down a road and back again. Your heart is true, you're a pal and a confidant.
I doubt very many rock musicians would analyze this chord progression using figured bass, like I've done here, but I did this on purpose to demonstrate a point. Instead, a Roman numeral analysis might look something like this. In the key of B flat, the first and last chords are 1 chords, then the second chord is a 2-4-2. But that third chord is difficult to stack as a tertian harmony. You might label it as a B flat major ninth chord, but that doesn't strike me as a very informative labeling. A rock musician who wanted to emphasize that the third of the chord is missing might instead call it a 1-7 sus2, which actually jives pretty well with the information presented in the figured bass. Rock musicians also like to use slash notation to label chords, and I think this is the most likely labeling that Bob Dylan or whoever else would use to describe these chord changes. This is better than the Roman numerals, because it shows how the upper voices form their own 1-2-5-1 chord progression on top of an independent bass line that camps out on B flat. This turns out to be a very ordinary chord progression played on top of a tonic pedal point. Slash notation helps performers in the treble register find the notes of the upper chord structure, while the bass player's job is made pretty easy because the notation clearly indicates what note the bass should be playing. The downside to this notation is that it implies that the bass voice and the upper parts are disconnected from one another. And even though bass lines in rock music can be much more independent than in other styles of music, they're never completely disconnected. This chord progression would be missing something really essential if the pedal point wasn't there. The slash notation doesn't communicate any information about what the relationship is between the upper chord and the bass note. Figured bass works the opposite way. Instead of looking from the upper chord structure down to the bass, we look up from the bass towards the other voices, and we simply list the intervals that each voice forms above the bass. You might say, well, this is just a list of intervals. This doesn't show the relationship between the voices any better than the other notation. But here's the thing. To a musician trained in counterpoint, this stack of intervals is chock full of information. It tracks the progress of specific melodic lines moving in relation to the stationary bass tone. The figures indicate exactly how many consonant and dissonant tones will make up each chord, and by highlighting the dissonance, it makes it possible to determine the correct treatment of the dissonance, either as a passing, neighboring, or suspension dissonance. The seventh, for instance, is clearly a passing dissonance, and these dissonant chords can be thought of as our first type of dissonant voice leading, a passing chord. We can analyze the entire pedal point as moving from a stable 5-3 position chord to another stable 8-5-3 chord, and the unstable dissonances in between are formed by passing motion. Just in case anyone thought that I'm implying that Bob Dylan stole the chord progression for Joker Man, Here's an almost identical passing progression in the key of B-flat from J.S. Bach. This repertoire is a little more historically appropriate for the figured bass treatment. The figures are slightly different, but you'll notice that they're basically just two different ways of harmonizing the same ascending soprano line, 5, 6, 7, 8. C.P.E. Bach described this type of progression in terms of passing function in his treatise on thoroughbass, and here we can see another variation on the same idea. C.P.E. Bach frequently mentions dissonant chords formed by passing motions and suspensions, although he doesn't go through voice-leading chords systematically. His goal was to teach his readers how to realize a figured bass to play a continuo part, not to teach them composition or theory. But he expected his readers to know counterpoint, so that when he used these terms to describe dissonance resolution, they would know what he meant. We'll go through Bach's examples in a moment, but let's take a second to go over how to mark up a score to indicate a passing function chord. For this chord progression, I would label the entire passage with a 1-chord Roman numeral, since that is the stable point of departure for the passing motion, and it is also the passing motion's goal in the fourth measure. Then, connect the figures that imply stepwise connection or resolution with diagonal lines. Finally, write an analytic slur that connects the beginning and end points and label the slur with a capital P. It will be difficult for anyone reading the score to misunderstand your interpretation. Here, we are saying that the entire passage prolongs or expands a tonic harmonic function through contrapuntal passing motion. Now let's take a closer look at my claim that Bach would have expected his readers to understand the figures from his treatise in terms of the rules of counterpoint. Here are 3 other figures from Bach's essay. The first one is pretty easy. If we give the notes slightly different durations, we can make it look exactly like something that could have come out of a species exercise. The tenor voice moves in second species half notes against whole notes in the other voices, and the dissonant seventh is formed as a well-behaved dissonant passing tone. That's why Bach included the figure for the octave on the downbeat. The performer needs to know that the seventh arrived by step from a downbeat consonance. In the second example, there are 2 second species lines in the soprano and alto voices. Keep in mind that I'm naming the voices after the SATB voice ranges, but that's just for convenience. Also, the plus sign next to the 4 in the figured bass for this passing chord is just a different way to indicate a raised note, in this case a sharp. In the last example, we see 2 different ways to realize the same figured bass, featuring slightly different inner voice motions. Here, there are 3 moving voices in quarter notes against a stationary soprano. Notice that the soprano C is repeated in quarter notes in Bach's realization, but I've written those notes as a single sustained dotted half note in my counterpoint model. Note repetitions don't count as voice-leading motions when we are analyzing the counterpoint of a piece of real music. Repeated tones were strictly controlled in species exercises, but of course, Fuchs couldn't stop composers from repeating notes all the time in real music. That means that common tones between chords often end up serving the role of a kind of pseudo-cantus firmus. The slowest moving voice can serve as a frame of reference against which the motion of the other voices can be measured. The first example, with only 1 species voice, you could call simple species counterpoint. I put simple in scare quotes because it usually means something slightly different in counterpoint. This is the only kind of example with one moving voice while the rest move in whole notes that Fuchs gives in the section on counterpoint in Gradus. Species exercises with more than one species voice are often referred to as combined species or mixed species exercises. Fuchs himself did not explain what the rules were for combining the species, and later generations of musicians had to infer the rules from inconsistent examples. These figured bass realizations by C.P.E. Bach, for instance, obey one of the more straightforward rules. Looking at this example, we can see that both of the half-note voices move in correct 2-to-1 second species relationship to the whole note voices. But with respect to one another, they also move in correct 1-to-1 first species relationship. In other words, because the half-note voices move at the same rate, they obey the first species rule that says that they must form consonant harmonic intervals with one another. In this case, they have to form consonances on the upbeat and the downbeat. Constructing an entire exercise in combined second species is considerably more difficult than the simple exercises. I just mentioned the first global rule, which is that the half-note voices must always form consonant intervals with one another. The only dissonances in this exercise are passing dissonances formed against the cantus firmus. The other main rule was first put forward by Ebenezer Prout, a man who does definitely look like an Ebenezer. He points out that the interval of a fourth is tricky, since it is a consonance between upper parts in a 3 or 4 voice texture, but it is a dissonance in only 2 voices. That means that the fourth is only a consonance on the downbeat of each measure when the whole note voice moves along with the others. On the upbeat, only the half-note voices move, and so on each upbeat, the blue voice, in this example, plays the role of a temporary bass. So fourths on the upbeat are dissonant and shouldn't be used. Notice also that in order to cadence, it might be necessary to change the species of one of the voices. This will depend on which of the voices has the cantus firmus. Voice crossings are encouraged, and when you use them, make sure they are clearly indicated with stem directions and the ordering of the figures in the bass. The upper voice is always on top, even during a voice crossing. There are 3 possibilities for how the chords work in each measure. First, both species voices can form consonances both on the upbeat and the downbeat. They can do this either by prolonging a single chord or by changing chord from the downbeat to the upbeat. The species voices could also form simultaneous passing tones, which will result in a very dissonant passing chord. Finally, we could also have a passing tone on the upbeat in one of the voices that is supported by a consonance in the other voice. Taking this example, let's say we've arrived at this 6/3 chord on the downbeat, and the cantus firmus will ascend by step in the next measure. This is a good opportunity to prolong a single triad throughout the measure. In this example, the upper voice leaps from a C to an E, and the bass leaps from an E to a C. In this way, the 2 voices trade notes, and we sometimes call this pattern a voice exchange, indicated with arrows showing the trade of notes. Voice exchanges allow us to move between the 6/3 position and 5/3 position of the same triad, and so we say the voice exchange prolongs that triad throughout the measure. It doesn't matter whether the 5/3 or the 6/3 version of the chord happens on the downbeat or the upbeat. Switching between the 2 is often a useful technique. Finally, voice exchanges work best when they move in contrary motion. It would have been possible, for instance, to have the bass leap up a 6th from E to middle C, but that would result in less independent voice leading. By only changing the first soprano note from C to B, we can see an example of a change of chord between the downbeat and upbeat. Here we have an E minor 5/3 chord moving to a C major 5/3 chord. There is a general rule about what kind of root motion is possible between downbeat and upbeat chords. The Cantus firmus whole note will necessarily be a consonant chord member of both chords, and it can participate in those chords either as the root, third, or fifth. Therefore, if we change chord from downbeat to upbeat, the triads will always be related to one another in root motion by third or by fifth. This example shows root motion by third, but we can also construct an example with root motion by fifth. Here we see the Cantus firmus G is the fifth of a C major triad on the downbeat, and becomes the root of a G major triad on the upbeat. This is all just another way of saying that root motion by third or by fifth is guaranteed between any two triads that share a common tone. Chords formed by simultaneous passing tones are the main subject of this video and these combined species exercises. The only rule, again, is that the half-note voices must form consonant intervals with one another on the upbeat. Here we see a passing ninth in the treble and a passing fourth in the tenor that move together in parallel sixths. If you want, you can mark up this passing chord with the diagonal lines and analytical slur that we learned about earlier. As you do your exercise, most of the fun will be in trying to construct the richest possible dissonant passing chords. The final possibility would be a dissonant passing tone in one voice supported by an upbeat consonance in the other. In this example, we see a dissonant passing fourth in the tenor voice, moving in parallel thirds with the treble voice. The note D forms a consonant third with the passing tone, and a consonant sixth with the Cantus firmus. This example shows the supporting voice moving in parallel stepwise motion, but the supporting voice may also leap as long as it forms a consonance both with the dissonant passing tone and the Cantus firmus. Here is a different example that shows a passing seventh in the top voice supported by the tenor note G, which was approached by a leap in contrary motion. This G forms a fifth with the Cantus firmus and a third with the dissonant passing tone. In an ideal world, our exercise would only include complete 5/3 or 6/3 triads on every downbeat, and dissonant passing chords on every upbeat. But it's not practically possible to compose that kind of perfect harmony over any given Cantus firmus. We're also going to have to use incomplete triads pretty frequently. That's all for this video. Stay tuned for the next one, when we will look at some of the other kinds of dissonant voice leading chords from thoroughbass and combined species counterpoint.